we are here to talk citizens. And we've got two amazing co-hosts and an awesome panel of guest speakers and provocateurs to do that with us over the next hour or two. Firstly, Ariane Conrad, who calls herself the book Doula. She is a best-selling editorial consultant and collaborating author of world-changing books. So she's birthed a number of books, from Find Me Unafraid by Kenny O'Deed and The Green Collar Economy by Van Jones. I'm hoping that Ariane's Doula is more like candles, aromatherapy, and a warm birthing pool rather than forceps or cesarean section, but John will be able to tell us about his experiences of working with her. And John Alexander, who is an old friend of mine, a citizens champion. He's the author and co-director of the new Citizenship project. John has memorably described us moving away from a world in which we are passive consumers and buying machines into active agents with power and to be the source of future ideas. So please put your hands together and give a very warm welcome to two marvellous citizens, Ariane and John.
Try to make this a little bit interactive and energized. So my name is Ariane, and I do call myself a Doula. I work with people who are making the world a better place. I don't think I write books about their big ideas, and in that, hopefully, scale the impact of their work and their ideas even further. Usually, so one of the earliest books that I worked on, we actually invented the term. Oh, you can't hear me. Uh-oh. Okay. We actually invented the term the Green New Deal. People associate it with some of the new progressive leaders right now, but it actually first appeared, as far as I know, in a book by Van Jones, a black environmentalist in the United States. And then another early project I did with Annie Leonard of The Story of Stuff. Some of you may know the video. It was one of the first viral videos. And that's right, some love for Annie and The Story of Stuff, and we worked on the book together. And usually I actually don't work with people who look like John. Out of 14 books that I've brought into the world in the last 14 years, only 2 have been with white men, because I am a believer in the fact that we've heard a lot from white men.
We talk too much.
and they just interrupt. And you know, as we all know, white institutions and white thinking has created the world that we're living in today. And I think we need new voices and new ideas. So generally, I'm not working with people who look like John. However, I think there's a role. You know, there are still a lot of white people in power, in control. And there's a role for, sometimes those people actually only listen or listen well to people who look like them. And John, one of the things I'm proudest of in this book is that we talk about what leadership looks like today, what citizen leadership looks like. And one of the pieces that John also models incredibly beautifully is passing the mic and taking the opportunity to share power and to invite other people to do the talking. So I'm incredibly honored to have worked on this book with him.
And I'm John Alexander, and I'm a white guy. Sorry. No, it's lovely to be here, and I'm clutching the book, partly because I'm obviously very attached to it, and it felt like a massive labour of love, but also because I want to read a little paragraph from it, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here and why we wrote this together. Really, I've been running a small consulting business called the New Citizenship Project for about the last 8 years. Off the kind of instinct that there had to be a way, I began my career working in the advertising industry, there had to be a way to use those skills to speak to people as citizens and invite them into their agency in the world, not just sell them stuff as consumers. But then, when the pandemic hit, with the way the world was shifting, I suddenly realized that what I'd become able to do as a result of doing that work was see a future. see a story that was kind of emerging and taking hold, that was so much bigger than any one bit of the work I was doing or anyone was doing, but that didn't have a name, didn't have a language to it, and therefore wasn't visible and wasn't possible to step into. And when we were working on the book, one of the first draft, the working title was actually, to this language of regeneration or revolution, was actually the Citizen Revelation. And the word revelation, this is the very short paragraph I wanted to read you just to get us going. And I think this is probably one of the bits that Ariane wrote because it's very well written. But what it says is, what if an alternative path to change opens up when we return to the concept of revelation? The moment of the veil dropping, the perspective shifting, an entirely new reality becoming apparent. The word revelation derives in part from the old French avaler, to sink, to lower, to get down. Instead of confronting the world as is head on, what if we need to get down underneath the surface, to get right to the foundations, to expose the roots of the story out of which everything is formed? And so we're going to talk more about this in a moment, but really the offer of the book is a way of seeing the moment in time we're living in through the lens of story. Seeing that we live today in what we call the consumer story, the idea that actually the right thing to do is for us to pursue self-interest and that somehow that will add up to collective interest, and yet that story is broken. The fact that there's another story kind of rising in this moment in time that's had huge power through the centuries, which is what we call the subject story, which is the authoritarianism, the kind of idea that we should just keep our heads down and do as we're told.
Subjects as in subjects of the king.
See, I'm not the only one who interrupts. Subjects as in subjects of the king. You're welcome. And finally, and most importantly, the citizen story, the idea that actually there is a possible future emerging that is taking shape everywhere in every aspect of society, where there is a strategy for building the future that is about tapping into the ideas and energy and resources of everyone, that is present in every aspect of society. We're going to get into that in a bit more detail in just a moment. Ariane is going to invite you to talk to one another, but before that, I just want to give you a sense of how the session's going to run this morning. Essentially, it's a really extended and kind of opportunity to get under a panel discussion. So we've got three wonderful people to discuss these ideas with people who've been building the story, and we're going to ask them to share their personal journeys with you. All of them feature in some way in the book as well, and then we're going to come together as a panel to discuss this future, to sort of round it out, to get your questions and challenges into it, and figure out whether we think this is something we might want to build and how we might build it. But first,
if you would, if you would find somebody, ideally somebody you don't know, you're sitting a very healthy distance apart from each other. I can see some of you, but if you can find a neighbor, ideally a stranger, and just introduce each other for a moment and answer the question, where is home to you? And then we'll be coming back to your new friend later in the session for another. But just right now, very quickly, find someone and introduce yourselves and tell each other where home is.
and if you're watching at home, you might want to message a friend. So, my friends, I hate to interrupt. You are going to be back in that conversation very soon, I promise you. That was just a very brief opportunity to say hello. I'm going to invite you to take your seats. We are, as I say, going to invite you back into that conversation in a minute. That was just really a chance to say hello, to get started. Only the beginning. But in order to put a bit more fuel into that conversation, we're going to get into the speakers and into the stories that we're offering. I'm just going to start that by saying a little word more about the ideas that we're putting forward in the book. Really, the core of this is, I think, and maybe the power of it, is that the place we're stuck at the moment is too many of the leaders and people in positions of power in our society can really only see two futures. They can only see the subject future looming, the authoritarianism, the fascism rising, and the consumer society that they've worked from and been stuck within for so long. And they think that what they're doing is defending against the authoritarianism and fascism by trying to reheat this consumer story, this idea that actually the role of the individual in society is to pursue self-interest. And I'll just unpack that a little bit more. The consumer story basically says the right thing to do, really. It's almost a morality. It's almost an idea of should rather than just could. It says that if we pursue self-interest, then that will add up to the best outcomes for society as a whole. If we choose the option that suits us best, then that will perpetuate an ever-rising standard. It's perhaps most clearly expressed in the Milton Friedman statement that the social responsibility of business is to maximize its profits, but it's in every aspect of life. That idea that pursuing self-interest will magically add up to the best outcomes. It manifests then in every aspect of our society. One of the ways I describe the situation we have in our politics at the moment is what we have as a consumer democracy, where our agency is limited to choosing between a fixed set of options that are offered to us every few years, every few months, it sometimes feels like, but only to choosing between them, and where we're encouraged to make that choice on the basis of self-interest. It manifests in business, where even the best businesses see our only agency as to buy better stuff, or to buy less bad stuff. It manifests in charities where we started to be treated as people who can only donate and leave the organizations to do the work for us rather than to involve us in that work. And that's a trap. And what I would argue, and what I think the great challenge is that the problems that we face in our society today are actually, they're not bugs in that story. They're not kind of slight flaws that we need to iron out. They're features. So we live in a story that says that society is a kind of a ladder that we should climb, and that the best thing you can do is get yourself higher up that ladder. And we have pervasive inequality. And those things are related. We live in a story that says that we're isolated individuals, that we should pursue, that self-interest is something narrowly defined, and that's what we should try and figure out and pursue. And we have an epidemic of mental ill health and loneliness. And that's a feature. And we live in a story that tells us that consuming, acquiring material stuff is the path to happiness. And we have ecological crisis, and that's a feature. It's not a bug. And so that story is collapsing. And in that collapse, in that uncertainty, the subject story is rising. Because in uncertainty, there is a great appeal to a strong man leader who will tell us what to do, who will take away that uncertainty that's so frightening. And in that situation, we're so stuck because the people who are trying to defend against that rise of the authoritarian, all they think they can do is serve us, look after us, do for us, acting from that consumer story, ask us to go back to our own self-interest, when actually there's a whole other story emerging that is about tapping into the ideas and energy and resources of all of us, that says that actually the path to the best society lies down a route of saying, let's get involved, that starts from an assumption about human nature that says we're collaborative, caring, creative creatures. We want to get involved. We want to contribute if those circumstances and opportunities are offered and created. And that's the story that we need to develop, I believe, and need to build. And that's what some of this session is about today. But just before we go into some of the personal stories, just to say a little word more about this concept of story.
Actually, I think we were going to have them talk first, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about story.
I thought that was now.
No.
Smooth as you like. Okay.
I think let's hear from Imi first. And then we'll come back around to the power of deep story.
So we're going to get into the 3 stories and the individual.
Actually, no, what? I'll go ahead. I'll say a little bit more about story. You might be right. Part of the reason why this is important, and we're talking about deep story here and narrative, is that what we know about the brain and the way the brain functions is that when you get new input, right, a sight, a sound, a piece of data, a new story, it doesn't connect directly to your decision-making centers. And instead it has to be processed first. And the way it gets processed is that it gets held up against the stories that we already have, the way we think the world works, the way the world may in fact work, or the story that we have about the way the world works. And in this processing process, often what the brain does is it ignores the new pieces that don't sync up with the stories that we already have in place about the way the world works. Or it invents motivations, motives, it invents connections that aren't actually there in the new input necessarily. And so that's why, particularly in climate, we've had this situation where what's been communicated has been data often, or timelines, this sort of thing, and it hasn't really passed through the processing process to the decision-making part of our brain and led to behavioral change. And that's why they say that the most effective way to dislodge an old story is to introduce a new story. And so this kind of, and again, we're talking about like deep stories and deep narratives. And one of my favorite examples of this kind of story is, we had in the 1800s, we had this white dude, Mr. Darwin, who observed a lot of things in the natural world and called what he saw, and arrived at the theory of evolution, called what he saw natural selection, right? But then you had another dude come along, Herbert Spencer, who coined this phrase, survival of the fittest. That actually wasn't Darwin, that was Spencer. And that became not just a thing that was operating in our understanding of sciences, right? That became a story about society and hierarchy and the economy and power. And it became a way of justifying power relations in the world, because what we said was, oh, well, they have the wealth, they must be the fittest, they must be the best, they're supposed to be at the top, right? We are still living inside that story in many ways, although it is breaking. And that is one of the last things that I want to say about deep story at this level, which is that when there is a shift in this deep sort of paradigm level of story, it is not an easy thing. And several people have alluded to this yesterday. It is grueling, it is torturous, often, and particularly for the people who are benefiting most from the old story. They're like, no. And we can hate on them, but we can also have some empathy for them, that it's a really difficult process. And some of us, like this wonderful woman, Carlota, who was up here yesterday, who is so embodying like a new era with Ola Luz. I don't know who all was here for that. Her work is so beautiful, and her story was so inspiring to me. But we forget sometimes when we're already living a new story, we forget how many people are living inside the old story and how difficult it can be to shift stories. So that's something that we talk about in the book, and also really hold during this time. So I think that's all I'm going to say.
So we now are going to introduce our speakers. And the idea of this, as we say, is really to introduce you to some of the people who we would say, and I think increasingly they would probably say themselves, are working from within this new paradigm, from within this new story, are working with this strategy of Let's tap into the ideas and energy and resources of everyone. Let's pursue that story that people are collaborative, creative, caring creatures if we can create the conditions for them to be so, and build the world that could be if we start from that assumption. They're working in all different domains. They've found different homes, different kinds of home, which is part of why we asked the question that we'll come back to in a little bit. And the first we're going to introduce you to is our good friend Kaur, whose home, I think she would probably say, is pretty firmly in Birmingham. So Imi, without further ado, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. I am hoping that a timer is going to come on soon. I'm really grateful to be here, and yes, I am based in Birmingham in the UK, and I'm based firmly in the middle of inner city Birmingham, and here's a large, nearly 100,000 square foot site of old industrial buildings that really speak to the story that I think John and Ariane talked about, of a time of great development and wealth extraction during the Industrial Revolution for the UK, where places like Birmingham were at the heart. Their canals were part of the industrial routes of much progress and much industrial progress for the city, at the expense of great extraction from the global south, processes that relied on the transatlantic slave trade, relied on large-scale imperial extraction from the global south, including the country that my parents and grandparents descended from in India. And this building really represents for me an example of the old story and the new story. Here's a story of 20th century exploitative economics that created wealth for a few, but really set us on a trajectory of a crisis that we are now feeling, probably not as acutely as those in the global south are. And here is also the beginning of a new story, a 21st century economics, one that is regenerative, distributive by design, that understands the scale of the transition that we are going to need to go through in how we live, work, play, eat, exist with one another, is going to need a scale of transformation that none of us can really imagine. And so Civic Square, the organisation that I run, is based in Ladywood, and we have a long, which I don't have time for, but a long history of building from the city level, looking at what the role of citizens and people in a place is in tackling complex systemic challenges. And we, for many years, did this at the Impact Hub Birmingham, and I wanted to give you kind of one really clear example of why I think that when we talk about this new story, it is both a story that I think is new and emerging, and I think it's also a story that isn't at all. And so from my experience of building crowdfunding, growing the hub, and there's lots online about this story if any of you want to hear about it over the last 12 years, was that there is absolutely no doubt at all to me that people from all scales of experience, lived, learned experience in their place, have and those most closest to challenges have absolutely the capabilities and capacities to engage. They might be time poor, they might not always have the tools and resources, but this idea that there's this layer of like smart people that can work on system challenges, and then there's like, we'll engage everybody else afterwards, is just fundamentally, absolutely, I think, a flawed story. When we were at the Impact Hub, whether we were working on complex projects around the system of children and families, or we were learning and playing and designing and running this beautiful space that we used to run, we used to have parents, children, the head of the children's service, people coming together in ways that felt quite raw at first, but actually the real deep learning for us was the incredible capacity that existed. And so during the Impact Hub, those 5 years, we prototyped and learned what it meant for citizens, for neighbours, for people of a place to really start to exert their ideas, their dreams, their knowledge, their tacit knowledge, their lived knowledge, their learned knowledge, all together in spaces that could start to tackle complex social challenges together. We've learned that actually what was really crucial is this wasn't actually that new. this story that we're seeing here of an old, struggling economic story that needed to develop into a new regenerative 21st century one was actually, and this huge transition we needed to go through, was one that actually we've seen many, many times in society, and I talked about this yesterday. And so we moved to the scale of the neighborhood, a scale that is both big enough to really have the diversity of experiences, to be able to interact politically, socially, technically, at many different layers of government, of organising and so on, but actually small enough that we could start to build a demonstrator of the future that we wanted to see. And this is one of the things I'm really, really obsessed with. The final quote that I'll just leave the presentation on talks about this idea of building islands of coherence, spaces in which that one step in the future. Because when you're building futures, you don't suddenly get to, unless you can somehow go and live off grid and completely extract yourself from everything, you don't get to move out of the incumbent system. You've always got one foot in it, and you've also got one foot in trying to build the future. And for me, it became really overwhelming to try and continue to build this at a city level or at a global scale. And I wanted to really show what was possible. And I wanted to show one idea of, over the last 10 years prior to Civic Square, that I had seen this creative, abundant capacity at every turn. I wanted to show that people where they were in every part of the city, in all their glorious diversity and skills and ages, could really interact with complex social challenges. So we went about starting to co-design this site, a site that would be a platform for the resources, tools, agency, learning that people would need so that neighbours and communities could be in the forefront of their own climate transitions. There's a lot of complex work that we've got on that, but I'm not going to talk to you about all of that today. But I'm really happy I'm here for the rest of the day if anybody wants to talk about governance and financing of retrofit or of reimagining economics work. But I wanted to just show you that actually what we started to do is we started to go into every school playground. We started to work in the side of the street. We started to work at the bottom of a tower block, and we started to introduce ideas such as donut economics, such as lots of stuff there around like how we reimagine futures, and we started to do it everywhere we could. And over the last 3 years, whether it's been at the bottom of a tower block in our neighbourhood, or a school playground, or a park, we started to build practical modular things that could become monuments to these ideas. We started to organise regularly, weekly, through growing, through making, through designing, through dreaming, through eating. And we started to show that at all scales, whether you're 6 or you're 60 or you're 106, maybe not 106, that might be that's probably not actually true. Maybe like 80, let's say, but 6, 1, and 60 sounded good, and I needed something else to come to the end of that. That people actually everywhere where they are deeply interested, deeply inspired, capable. Here on the bottom right, this is a group that we have been running for the last 4 holidays in our neighbourhood that have been starting to take the principles of donut economics and the planetary boundaries and starting to explore the quality of soil in their place, or starting to look at the quality of air in their place. We've been calling it neighbourhood science. And this is a holiday club that we just repurposed to say that it's not that we don't think it's great that the kids can play football and go on trips, but they really, really can engage in a lot more. And so what we haven't been doing is we haven't been starting to select, we think you're the type of people that can engage with this. We've been doing that hard work of unpacking, building new stories, building the tools and the ideas for people of all ages to engage. And so this is a short part of the story to say that whether it is the large-scale retrofit of our entire neighbourhood and the redesigning of the governance and finance, or it's the summer holiday club, the underlying story from our neighbourhood and from the work we're trying to do is that let's forget this story for a moment that capacity isn't there. It absolutely is. Let's forget this story that we can't reckon with our imperial, extractive, quite difficult past and have honest conversations with it and reimagine a new economy together. But for the last minute, I want to kind of leave you with a bit of a reflection. I'll just leave it on that picture because it's a nice one, isn't it? But I don't want us just to get stuck in the story of engagement and neighbours and capacity, because yes, it is all there. I can tell you really fundamentally, over the last 12 years, thousands and thousands of ordinary, everyday, incredible people from Birmingham and from our neighbourhood have engaged, whether we are working on unlocking small sites and working with building new housing on it, to whether it has been playing or lunch or imagination or big concepts like reimagining the economy or this very complex retrofit project that we're working on. The engagement, the excitement, the interest, the ability to reckon is all there. Yeah, we have to do some work to translate, to make tools, to create platforms, to create experiences. No one has ever said to us, gosh, this is way too complicated. They've always come to this space and said, how can we, how might we? But what I want to leave us on is just one small anecdote, that this isn't necessarily a new story. I talked about it yesterday when I had the conversation with Angie Tangeri and the learnings from Indigenous communities in New Zealand. I talked about it yesterday on the panel with all those neighbourhood examples. But there is one really clear thing that I said yesterday as well, and I want to repeat again, which is that we have to infrastructure some of this. We have to make sure that we understand that this is like the equivalent, and I'm only going to use a British imperial example because obviously I'm from Britain, apologies. But when we came out of the World War, we were poor, the country was bankrupt, people were sick. Whether you were morally on the side of the Welsh workers who were like healthcare for everyone, or you were on the side of GDP and productivity, we need people to get back to work. We understood that you can't just shout from the top, like John was saying, can everybody go and get well, please? Can everybody go and care about the climate, please? We need you back to work, we need to sort things. It doesn't work like that. The role of us, yes, is to tell new stories. Yes, it is to translate. Yes, it is to get proximate and deep in our places. But our role is also to infrastructure it. We built the NHS. That's the role of the country, of legislation, of big money. We built regional hospitals. That's the role of your municipality, your city council, whatever you call it. And then we did one crucial thing. We built neighbourhood GPs. We put the tools, the resources, the ideas, the access a couple of minutes from your house. And so the reason why I'm showing that picture at the beginning is I believe in all the work I've been doing, but I do also believe that unless we put the tools, the resources, the ideas, the spaces, just into the everyday, you just wander down the road and it becomes easy to biodiversify, it becomes easy to understand how to clean up your air, it becomes easy to organise, to share, to connect, to play, then no amount of stories is going to get over that. So movements like ours have to also move into how we build that, how we repurpose that high street shop, how we repurpose our front lawn, the garden underneath our school playground or whatever. And we have to start showing that story in practice with tools, because this is not just a story we can talk about. So I just wanted to finish on this to say that all times, whether it is when we built the libraries or the education system or the NHS, the fundamental thing that helped us move through and everyone's story was when we put the tools and the resources and the ideas into people's hands. And that's what Civic Square is about. And that's what I really believe, not because I think there should be hundreds of Civic Squares everywhere, but every street corner, every GP, every library, every empty space we have, every corner that we can organise in has to start being about this new story in practice. And that's my invitation to everyone. And thank you so much for your time.
I just wanted to follow up with one question.
Thank you. Which is, so what we're trying to tease out a little bit in the first part here is choosing the domain of engagement, right? Mm-hmm. If we're talking about the citizen story and engagement, choosing the domain. And this realm of sort of power dynamics and race in the choice. Like, I know your journey was, you were working at a national foundation or organization, and then you went back to your roots in India. So like, what role did it have in your life in settling on the domain of the neighborhood ultimately? And what would you say to someone about how to navigate those dynamics?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, obviously, in my younger career, being able to be involved in a lot of different things and be able to experience and see the world as quickly as possible was really useful. And I had a lot of privileged experiences in traveling and so on. But as I slowly started to unwind decolonize my own story, right? And I don't want to throw that word around too lightly, because it does get thrown on everything, apparently, like you can see on the news at the moment. But when I started to understand, actually, so much of the roots of where I'd come from, the village I'd grown up in, my parents had grown up in, the way my family had organized, some of the things that Angie talked about yesterday, about learning about where my spirit took me and the scale of organizing, rather than this story that the country, the consumer story, the career that you need to go to, get to London, get to the top. You could be a CEO of a foundation or something, and you're just kind of following it, and you're sort of like, oh, I don't know, I think this is the right thing. And being able to pull back from that and say, hold on a second, I come from a really strong line of matriarchs who really understood how to organize in their village. I come from a big family. I know how to organize and convene people. I want to demonstrate that future today. So what I would really advise is it sounds like a really privileged thing to do, but try and find spaces that lets you hear where your spirit's calling you. Because there is the role for those who can write a book, or who can describe the problem in a way that convenes people, or who can do the big, huge, convenings. But those roles are overemphasized. And the real role of maintenance, creation, being able to build on what your ancestors or your lineage tells you, it's kind of damped down, and it certainly was when I was at school. That stuff was you don't bring it up, and you just kind of follow this story of progress. So try to listen to what your spirit takes you, and then where your spirit takes you, and then just trial a few things. And the biggest thing that helped me is being able to just practice in the smallest possible unit, just like the front lawn, the street, and understand what that starts to do, and then understand your role in that. Maybe you're like a civil servant that can do multiple things. Maybe you should start engaging that street. Maybe you are engaging the entire music industry. I can see Brian. But you have to really, I think you really have to, we have to, that fixation that Brian talks about, I think is really clear. We are going to have to both have solidarity with one another and real deep clarity about the layers in which we can, one, deeply influence, where we can stay proximate, and we can have a long-term story, because these things don't happen in a couple of years. Transition's going to take 30, 40, 50 years, and hopefully, we will get ahead of some of the really scary tipping points. But they don't just happen in a minute. And so that's the thing about being able to find the places where you can be proximate and stay and build and build and build and not flit around to many things. That's what helped me. And that's why returning back to the neighborhood feels most like the big family I grew up in, feels most like the villages that my ancestors have taught me stories. And I was like, okay, well, let's interpret that and let's get going. And that's really similar to what Angie Tangeri talked about yesterday.
Right.
So yeah, that's my small take on that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And next, we're going to hear from Bethany, who is a designer and a serial entrepreneur who is bringing the citizen alive in the realm of enterprise and business.
Thank you. Hi.
Keep talking.
Hello. Yes,
Yeah.
perfect. All right. First of all, Emmy, thank you. That was amazing and inspiring, and I feel honored to be here amongst you and this group. So I'm going to kind of talk about, I guess, my story, and I guess kind of a similar thread around kind of stepping out of a specific narrative around kind of progress and business, and kind of what business I think was kind of telling me in terms of kind of career choices, and then how I actually used business, I guess, as a platform to experiment and create more collective participatory experiences and organizations. So I followed a path. And I'm going to reference someone that John introduced me to named Phoebe Tickle, who has this beautiful thing called moral imagination, where she talks about us all being on this train and kind of, we're all on the train and there's no brakes. I'm going to totally bastardize and oversimplify this, but we're all on this train and we think there's no brakes, and then all of a sudden there's like a catastrophe, and it turns out there were always brakes. And the train stops, and everyone's terrified to kind of figure out what to do because no one's ever not been on the train. And I think when I heard that story, I just kind of like saw my life on this train, and I realized that actually I'm really comfortable stepping off the train and being one of those people that kind of explore what may be not understood or not clear yet, and kind of stay in that messy space of figuring out what might be next. And I think that's a kind of good starting place for the business I started. So I started a business called Tech Will Save Us it's like 10 years ago. I started it because I became a mother for the first time, and some of you might be parents. I went to the toy department for probably the first time since I was a child, and it just felt terrible. It was gendered. It was incredibly uncreative in terms of the way it was introducing technology for kids. And having worked in design and worked in the technology industry for a very long time, it really was kind of shocking that this industry that was serving the next generation just really wasn't providing creative tools for kids. So we built this, big business. We followed a very specific path. We raised investment from VCs, and I was kind of stepping off the train of having worked in a branding agency for years and kind of talking about social entrepreneurship with all these big businesses, and figuring out if I could really step into that story myself and build a business that really delivered on profit and purpose in a really fundamental way. So not just talk about it, but actually do it in the world. So over time, we built what was essentially a very big business. We sold in 4,000 retailers globally. We had 45 products in the range. And very early on in the business, we decided we were going to launch product in community. So we launched most of our products on Kickstarter. So we used Kickstarter. We raised, hundreds of thousands of pounds by launching these products. And what was super amazing was that we were building a business with others, ultimately. We were testing what those products might be. So one of the products we launched was a product that was all about encouraging kids to move, called the Mover. And it basically asked kids to program 67 LEDs, and the more you ran, the more you moved, the more the lights would interact and create different kinds of activities. So kids were learning programming and electronics and creative problem solving, but they weren't doing it because we wanted them to learn coding. They were doing it because they wanted to create a game of hot potato, or they wanted to create a toothbrush trainer where the longer you brushed your teeth, the more the lights would turn. So it became this really playful, engaging way of launching products with kids and with families, getting feedback very directly. We built a digital platform that ultimately had 250,000 kids globally actually feeding into our process of product development, which was also an amazing experience to kind of build the infrastructure to do that. And also, crowdfunding is really messy and it's really hard. You put things out in the world and you get lots of amazing feedback, but you also get a lot of criticism. You get a lot of people asking you to do more, to do less, to tell you what you're not doing, why you're not doing it. And we had to come up with, ways of filtering and understanding how we were gonna, make decisions and how we could deliver certain kinds of outputs that were still aligned with goals and values and ultimately put kids at the center of it, but also not overstretch ourselves, because we were still a small team trying to make something quite significant in terms of a shift in kids' education. And so, it was also really nourishing, because some of the products we came up with, I don't think we would have ever imagined them if a 7-year-old hadn't told us that they wanted to learn about sound and make electronic guitars with cardboard. We tried to create things that were really accessible, because we figured that a lot of kids that were interested in these skills just didn't have the means to actually kind of engage in some of these tools. And so even with all of that kind of, being exposed and launching things in community, we also had really intimate relationships with real people, the kids themselves, the families that were using these tools, to make what we called a low barrier to entry. So it had a low floor. It meant that almost anyone, no matter what your skill set, could enter into the experience, and a high ceiling. If you were really technical and found real kind of confidence in some of these skills, you could do an awful lot with the products. So these kinds of concepts were all essentially developed with people, with our community. So we sold that business about a year ago, and I really started to think about, where we were in terms of kind of product development and families. And we started a studio, which is a social innovation studio called FAM. And I think the experiment in kind of community and citizen that we're trying to create with FAM is really about kind of connecting to what we think is an evolution of family. That, and Emmy talked about this a little bit, the current kind of infrastructures that we're living within, which we call the nuclear family, are just not working for a lot of people. And it's quite a new concept in terms of our experience as a family. We moved from this kind of foraging and kinship family to the kind of nuclear family model, which we're currently in. And we think there's an evolution happening, and it's at the edge, but we think it's called the regenerative family. We think it's something that's moving us from something that's quite, and I think this is a kind of journey that design has gone through, that architecture is going through, that agriculture is going through, a kind of family unit that was aware of issues, to a family unit that was actually active, recycling, and there were infrastructure developing that allowed us to contribute to a kind of society that was better. And yet, in the family system, anxiety is the highest it's ever been in history with kids and families. There's new norms that are developing because of COVID around kind of working from home and co-living and different kinds of structures. And there's not a lot of services or resources or tools that are actually serving that type of structure. We think that a lot of the industry that's serving families is kind of reinforcing old models. It's reinforcing us being busy. It's reinforcing us overscheduling our kids. It's reinforcing us kind of going on that pathway of kind of success at no cost. And so what we've tried to kind of underline are a few specific shifts that we think are fundamental to thriving, no matter kind of what the uncertainty is of the future. One is about, and very much aligned with John and what John has been talking about with Ariane, around moving from this very passive engagement to raising kids and building families that are built on creative citizenship. What are the services, the products that are going to really support that to happen from a fundamental kind of structure of family? What are the ways in which we're moving from this very linear education model, which is just so not fit for purpose, to something that's much more expansive in terms of the learning and skills that we really need in terms of family units and kids? And finally, this, and there's a zeitgeist that's been talked about a lot in the sessions in this conference for sure, around our disconnection from nature, and how do we really include and connect and help those that even may not feel comfortable in nature to have that intimate relationship with the natural world. And this looks a bit scary, but what we're experimenting with is a model that is not so simple. Because, and I was thinking about this morning, I think when you're in the middle of a shift, it is a bit messy. And I don't think that the models that I've experienced, tech will save us, we raised funding, we focused very specifically on selling directly to customers, we built subscriptions, reoccurring revenue, like all the stuff that investors and businesses tell you should do. And it was never enough. We could never sell enough, we could never reach enough, we could never reach enough kids, we could never lower our prices low enough to make it accessible to everyone. It just was never enough. As much as I loved that business, it really just never felt like it got to everyone. And I think what we're experimenting with is how do we actually explore kind of citizens within other institutions and organizations? How do we work with academia, which is so kind of in its own unit right now? There's so much research around family structures, around social norms that are not getting accessed by those delivering services to kids and families. How do we encourage policymakers and industries to really co-create solutions with families directly, as opposed to assume that they understand the solutions? A lot of times when you work with families and kids, the co-creation takes the form of what is called a kind of focus group. It tends to be very transactional. It tends to be very kind of one-dimensional. So we're exploring ways that we can actually build more participatory models where these kind of connections happen between academia, industry, and policy, where solutions are coming out of that in a much more kind of productive and proactive way. So there are a few examples, and I'm running out of time. I won't go into all of them, but we're not the only ones exploring these spaces. And it happens to be that a lot of them are called labs. And I think the reason is because they are experiments. They're experiments in combining policy, new structures, new kinds of funding, working with citizens that are in the world, living their lives, as well as academia, as well as policy at the same time. And it's not easy. And none of these are a solution yet. They're all kind of emerging. but they're very exciting opportunities to kind of, whether it's redeveloping education with Youth by Youth, which is a youth-led organization creating regenerative education systems, or whether it's New Public, which is, they call themselves an incubator for safe digital spaces. It's part academic, part VC, part entrepreneurship, kind of venture funding. Beautiful, beautiful work. So these are the types of experiments I'm really excited about in terms of business, because I think the current models are not really comfortable with working with real people. They don't have the infrastructure. Crowdfunding is amazing, but it is not the only way, and it isn't really including all the voices that need to, I guess, be in these solutions. So that is my presentation.
Thank you so much. There's just one thing I really want to underline in this, and something Ariane and I wrote a bit about in the book, is this idea of the power of amateurs and the kind of the idea of the multiple expertises that are out there, and that in a world of the consumer story, as we sort of termed it, don't get recognized because there's professionals who do stuff for us.
Yes.
And I just wondered if, like, where does that, like, you sort of alluded to it, but just really underline that for us. Like, there's so many different kinds of expertise in what you're saying, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's like the amateur in terms of like, I'm an amateur in terms of starting businesses. I mean, I didn't go to business school. I didn't do the kind of traditional pathway to starting businesses. I just saw it as almost like a medium for experimenting. I saw it as a way of bringing some of these ideas to life that could really deliver social impact and kind of address needs and actually create livelihoods for people and create collaborations, etc. I think that there's then the kind of amateurs in everyone. I mean, no one really knows what they're doing, to be honest, right? Like, even the most...
What a beautiful truth.
The most senior people that have had extensive careers and tons of case studies about, delivering outcomes, those outcomes may not be relevant anymore, and so they're amateurs in delivering new outcomes. And so I think the idea of being, a kind of expert in anything forever is almost a fallacy. I feel like we're always unlearning something in order to make space for something new, and I think if we can meet each other there, that's when real productive conversations and honesty, vulnerability, the stuff that actually business should be built on, comes out. And I think those are the experiences I've enjoyed the most in creating businesses.
Woohoo! Thank you, B. So, those of you who came to this session with the word citizen and thought this was going to be about politics and have been going, what's going on here? Now is your moment, because we are going to turn to what does this mean in the sphere of democracy and politics. And I'm very excited to introduce my dear friend Yago Bermejo, who's going to talk to us about the journey of the domain of the citizen being the political system.
Muchas gracias, John. Voy a hablar en castellano, en español. Si alguien no entiende...
Thank you. I'm going to speak in Spanish.
I'm going to speak in Spanish, okay? Bueno, ¿quién se siente identificado con esta pancarta? Real democracy.
Here it reads, real democracy. Do you...
Vale, empiezo a hablar en español ahora, ya estáis con los cascos puestos.
So now, yes, please use your headset. My name is Yago, and I work in the field of democratic participation, and more specifically in how making sure that people can take part in the decision-making process. So how to go beyond elections? How can we directly get citizens involved in the decision-making process in governments? So for a long time, we have been asking for this real democracy. For more than 10 years now, we feel that the democracy that we have is not enough. We want to go beyond this election cycle. This is the 15M movement in Spain. I took part in it, but it also took place in other places in the world. For example, the Occupy movement or the Tahrir Square, also in the Arab world. So this was like an awareness-raising movement. People were aware that they needed to go back to this idea of democracy so that citizens can take part in this decision-making process. I've spent 11 years working very hard, and most of those people who were activists at the beginning are still working on this, and we are working to test and to find new alternatives to elections so that citizens can take part in the decision-making process. We've worked in the Madrid and Barcelona city councils, in different regions in Spain, here in Catalonia, also even at the European level. The mechanism that we think has the most impact and that we are the most specialized in is citizens' assemblies. Why? Well, because they generate an alternative legitimacy to elections, and they allow to take very important decisions in a government. The Citizens' Assembly, as you can see here, is a group of around 100 people that meet in these plenary sessions and working groups and working tables in this case. How these people are selected, how can they participate? Well, they are selected through a democratic process of selecting. So we give the same possibility of all citizens. For example, in Barcelona, we held one assembly here in Barcelona, and so everyone could receive a letter and they could accept to take part in this assembly. So with all people accepting this letter, we have a descriptive group of people, and this is why it is an alternative, a real alternative to elections. So this is not something that we have invented here in Spain after the 15M movement, but this has been used for more than 15 years in almost all continents in the world. It has been mainly used in Europe, though. And, well, actually, after all these years of experience, and I think that you are all aware of that, there are many things happening today in the world which has less to do with the local or national or European level. Most of these problems go beyond these levels. These are global levels, and the solutions need also to be global. We need to be all together in that. So the search of this real democracy led us to this void, actually. So how can we make decisions at the global level? Because can this global democracy exist as such? Because if we do not have a global government, who's ruling the world, actually? And this is a question that we need to ask ourselves. So this is this typical study on the powerful countries. We have here the US with the biggest military and economic potential in the world, then China. So we are more interested on this second question, actually. What kind of people are ruling the world? I think that this is a very interesting question for us to ask ourselves. This is a meeting of the Security Council of the UN. Only some countries in the world have access to this meeting. And as always, a lot of old white men. Here you have this meeting of the World Economic Forum, where apart from the big power and power countries, there are also the big companies in the world. Again, we see a lot of old men. Well, all these people who have really this power in the world, they have another thing in common, which is that they belong to the 1% of richest people in the world. And maybe you can think, well, maybe some of them do not belong to this 1%. Well, actually, this 1% means 70 million people already. So in this 1%, all the members of all the governments of all the countries in the world, they are included in this 1% because their wages are high enough to be included in this 1%. And most of them also have very important positions in the main big companies of the world, and so they have a big impact and influence on the evolution of the world. So here you have the 1% of richest people in the world, and now I'm going to focus on one of these global problems. For example, climate change. You see that this 1% have an impact of 17% of emissions. So 1% has an impact of 16%. Then if we move on to the next percentage, 10%, which is more or less the percentage of people having higher education, I guess that we belong to this 10% of people with higher education. But the bad news is that these 10% of people who also has a very high consumption level, they have better jobs, they have higher wages, so they consume more and then have a higher impact on the emissions. So what we see here is that if we add this 10%, more 16%, so almost half of the global emissions are produced by 11% of the richest people in the world, in the planet. Of course, if we are lucky and if we have a position in a company or in a government, maybe instead of being a professor in a high school, maybe we will be working in a ministry. Okay, so maybe we can move from here to there. But, well, this 10% has an influence on people ruling the governments. So we can say that this 11% is about 700 million people who can influence in the direction the world is following. Then we have this middle, 40%. These are workers without higher education. They earn less money and they are in countries such as China. They are less in Europe, actually. But there are also people like this in Europe. And then what's most surprising, there is 50% of the world's population in green who are only responsible for 9% of the emissions that cause the climate change. So these people are really outside this global governance. And we know that they are not responsible for this climate change and they are not included in the governance system in the world. So, what would happen if we would add this 50%? So, imagine that we create an assembly with 100 people. So, in an assembly with 100 people, the 1% of richest people will be represented by one person. However, this 50% of people with a lower social and economic level will be represented by 50 people in this assembly. So, it will be like turning things completely around. So let's let aside those who are ruling the world and let's put those people who are not ruling the world now in that position, and those people who do not have any impact on climate change, let's change their position. So can we make everyday people rule the world? Well, that's what we wanted to work on 2 years ago, a group of people from different countries. And we designed what we called the Global Assembly in 2021 about the ecological and climate emergency in order to have an impact on the COP26 held by the UN last year. Of course, having a global citizens' assembly was a huge challenge. And the first problem is that in order to gather this 100 human, we needed to do this global lottery. Because for that you would use the database of one country, but we do not have such a global database of humans. But we were able to create, our friend Brett from Citizenship Foundation discovered this database, which gathers all the municipalities of the world and their population. So this was a way for us to do so. We needed to give the same opportunity to the same citizens of the planet to be elected. So let's say, okay, let's draw this, let's have this lottery. So based on this database of population density, we tried to give to all citizens the same opportunities. So, of course, people living in Shanghai could have more possibilities than someone living in Toledo in Spain. So, well, okay, we distributed 100 points in the planet, and as you see, there is a correlation between the high-density areas and the points for the selection of participants in the assembly. That was the first step, having 100 points. We were a small team with a little budget. Of course, we could not travel all around the world to go and find those people. So we had to develop this system. This system says that each member of the assembly will have a mediator associated to it. That's what we call community hosts. What we did was to recruit so next to those points, we recruited a community host who would be responsible of recruiting the person itself. As you can see, if we go around the world, the families that we find is this type of families. So these are people who do not have a good internet connection. These are people who do not have a good mobile or a good laptop to work with. So those mediators, those 100 community hosts or mediators, not just needed to find those people in a random way, but they also needed to include them in a digital conversation, because this would be a digital assembly. So these were digital mediators offering a good computer and a good connectivity to these people that took part in the assembly. The next challenge, if we go beyond colonial languages, so international languages that are spoken today, such as English, French, Spanish, well, we discovered that only the most educated people in the countries speak those languages. In other lower levels, those languages aren't spoken, mainly in countries of Africa, in India. So those mediators also needed to translate for the people who were taking part in the assembly. Of course, this complicated the task a lot, but well, here you have the example of some mediators in India, and you see them speaking with local people in local languages, inviting them to take part. So those mediators also had to pay those people, translate for them, and to include them digitally. Okay, finally, we got there. So these 100 mediators could recruit 100 people randomly in these 100 locations, randomly distributed on the globe. And this assembly was worked for more than 68 hours in online groups over several weekends. Here you have the mediator next to the participants. So mediators were the border of the image, and they were constantly translating into English, and then from English they were translating in the several local languages. Of course, we have been working on that with very low resources. Translators were not professional, and translator was consecutive translator. It was not a simultaneous translation as the one you have today here. So the product of this, or the output of this assembly, was the declaration called People's Declaration for the Sustainable Future of Planet Earth. This is a declaration, which is a text that was agreed by all the groups and the working groups of the assembly, and it was submitted to the UN during COP26. My final comments are the following. Do you remember 11 years, we have been for 11 years working in this real democracy? Well, okay, if we want this real democracy, changing democracies in our countries won't be enough here in our comfortable Europe. No, this is not enough. We need to be aware that real democracy is global, which is necessary today. Okay, and also this democracy is not a utopia. This is something that is feasible. It's really feasible. It can be done. To me, the most important aspect of this project is not that much the fact of having this agreed declaration, but the fact of proving that this is feasible. We can ask ourselves why the UN is not doing this already. Well, actually, we are trying to talk to them, to try and help them to launch something like this. And that's all. Thank you very much.
The Global Assembly is one of my favourite projects and just one of the most exciting things in the world, I think. And it's sort of making that more visible, making all these stories more visible is such a big part of this work. I wonder, Yago, just as a parting word before we're going to invite the audience back into conversation with one another a little more, but just a parting word, like, what was the most exciting moment for you in that process? What most brought you alive for this?
I think the most exciting moment was when we discovered that it was possible, because when we started the project, we really thought that it could be completely impossible to get 100 people at the end. So finally, when we started to recruit, this community host, and those community hosts started to test, we did some kind of test before the assembly. So we create, for example, one Zoom room with 10 people before the 100, and we tested that. And we realized, no, this is working. I mean, we have one person from Pakistan who believes that the climate change is created by God, and she's talking from a little village in Pakistan. At the same time, we have some person from Latin America, another one from Africa. So this can be done, and it's feasible. And this consecutive translation is working. We have a lot of doubts about that also, no? How do this consecutive translation obviously is more complicated than the interpretation we had, for example, in the Conference on the Future of Europe. With the European money, we have direct interpretation in 24 languages. It was super smooth, but in this case was a little bit more complicated. So yes, I think that moment in the labs of the previous to the assembly when we discovered that was possible was the most exciting moment for me.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Yago. So we can see, like, these all three of these stories, and there are so many more, speak to us about this future that is already building, right? This is not just the kind of a moral argument about what should happen. It's not a kind of, we wish this could, this is being built. This is there. And the really fascinating thing, two things I want to just observe. The first is that it's really everywhere, and it's all these scales and all these domains. And it's just a little bit hidden. But the moment you peel back the surface, you find it everywhere. And the second is that, and I think Imi brought this out really beautifully, this isn't, in some ways it's a new story because it requires this sort of figuring out in the current context, and Bethany and Yago spoke to this, all three of them spoke to this kind of experimentation and the kind of learning that we're going to need to do on this path, because one of the reasons why the consumer and subject stories are so visible to those in positions of power is because they're off the peg, right? They're there. We know what they look like. And the challenge, a big part of the challenge of the citizen story is that we don't know exactly how to do it, but that is also the joy of it. We're going to figure this out together. All of our wisdoms are going to contribute to it. But it's also, as Imi really powerfully pointed out, it's also a very old story. It's like the deepest truth within us, that we are by nature citizens. We are collaborative, creative, caring creatures. Deep in our history, beyond the age of even writing and kings and empires, there is this sort of this wisdom in us, this ability, if we can design for it and, as Imi put it, infrastructure it.
Okay, we're going to have our wonderful speakers up in a panel, but before we do that, some of you were maybe not here right at the beginning. We had you find a stranger and introduce yourselves and say where home is. Go back to that person if you were here. If you weren't here then, find someone. And this time, what we'd like for you to do is reflect on this idea of home in this broader sense in terms of the terrain or the domain of your engagement. So we heard about different journeys. We heard, for example, that maybe you don't have to be an expert in order to engage in a domain. Maybe you don't have to have the law degree or the business degree in order to engage, or the ways in which power and power dynamics, race dynamics, gender dynamics play into where you feel like you'll be heard, because that's another piece of how you can engage and citizen in whatever realm. So if you find your person and spend just a couple moments talking about this kind of home, where is the home in which you can engage as a citizen?
And we're going to give you about 10 minutes for this conversation, so do feel free to unpack it a little bit. Yeah, half hour for the panel. We're bang on.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can start to settle.
I'm going to grab my water.
Do you need a water or anything?
Yeah, I've got some water here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to ask you, you're going to be speaking English in the panel? Or, okay, great. Then I don't need to bring the translator. Okay, thank you.
You guys want to come up and grab a seat? Where do you want me? Where do you want to... Shall I be far end from you? Shall we bracket them? Rather?
Yeah.
So I'll go far end.
Okay.
Hey, ladies and gents. Hello, hello. Can I get my mic? Am I on? Can we hear me? Hello.
That's a good sign that no one.
Hello, hello. Welcome back, my friends. So we're going to make this a bit more of a conversation, but before, and we're going to sort of this conversation was already kind of taking off, so I was like, oh God, stop. But before we talk a little bit more and then bring you in a bit more, we wanted to start a little bit with what you've been talking about. So would anyone like to just give us a flavor of their conversation? It doesn't have to be a question, doesn't have to be perfectly formed. Just give us a little flavor of the conversation. We've got a couple of mics. So I don't know if you just raise your hand if you'd like to just share a taste. Down the front, if we may. Ipek, can I? Oh, we got, there we go. Mics on every side, please.
Thank you very much. I'm super inspired by what I have heard. And for me, the most incredible thing, because we started that I started feeling home here like a year ago. And I realized that what made me feel home is creating a community of international people who are doing, like, have the same values as I do. And I don't know, for me it's an incredible revelation, because I mean, I value my community. It was our tribe that I was creating for 3 years, but with how much it makes you feel home is incredible. Mm-hmm. And another side was trying to integrate, for example, as an international person from wherever, like here, and trying to mix with the Catalan community, for example, which was my first 2 years of experience here, is incredibly difficult. That makes you, in the end, feel really lonely. And we touched this topic actually yesterday, that what do we do with people who are renting? That was the question from the audience. And I think this is also one of the keys, like this, creating this, finding the infrastructure for creating the communities, like little tribes within the city. That was very empowering for me and made me feel home, and I thank you for the opportunity to share this.
Thank you very much. We'll look for another couple of voices from the room. There's one back in the middle, if that's all right. Just while the mic comes to you, just to share one correction to our esteemed host, Mr. Gillespie, who said at the beginning that the word citizen comes from the word civitas, which means city. Actually, it doesn't. So the derivation is exactly the opposite. The word citizen comes from the word civis, which came before civitas. And the word civis actually literally means together people.
Oh.
So the word citizen literally means together people, people who only have meaning together. And a city is just a place where people are together. So I just wanted to offer some of that in response to what you're saying. Please.
So I think our combination is quite interesting, because we both find home is where our family and friends are, and we both have homes. We're both from here, but we both have homes in other countries that are far away to different degrees. So that was a really interesting connection point. But then on the second question, we're completely different, because I feel that I'm really not engaged with my community to my own shame. And then I've taken lots of notes now to, okay, how could I find something here? It always feels like there's so many things going on outside, and I don't see the ones maybe going on in my city. And she's the opposite. She's engaged on everything, and they need more people.
Just to increase your shame.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I'm like, oh God. So it is really badly balanced. No, but it makes me think also, how can we help these people get their voices out there? Because I didn't even know any of the associations and tables and gatherings that she mentioned, right? And coming from a communication background, I'm always thinking they need something to be out there and be asking for more people, because what we got to is that in the end it's the same faces you find everywhere, no? The same faces, and I don't think, I guess I'm proof of it, they're not the only ones worried about that and caring about that and having ideas, right? But for some reason, I'm in the comfort of my home, I'm reading books, but I'm not stepping out and engaging personally, no? And why is that?
Thank you so much. We'll take one more sounding, if we may. Anyone from this side of the room? Have we got anyone who'd like to share? It's quite densely populated to Yago's diagram, so I feel like we should have it represented. We'll come here.
There was a hand.
There was a hand?
Yeah, in the middle there.
Yeah, that's it. So we were talking about how home feels like your parents' house, but since leaving our parents' house, it feels like we're in that generation that are constantly moving or renting, and so finding home, for me anyway, it feels like a place where there are people that are doing similar. So I was saying that, for example, me and my sister, we started a knitting club, and it's in an area that I was living in, but not in anymore. So it feels like I know that community and I'm getting to know my new community. But essentially, whenever we do these clubs, it feels like we're meeting new people. Everyone kind of feels a sense of familiarity because you're doing something that either reminds you of your parents, grandparents, like a hobby or something that you want to improve on. And I think it's, kind of home feels like a place where people are kind of together doing something that they're passionate about, but also like a safe space. But I think it's really difficult to replicate in a I guess city or a system where loads of people are constantly moving around. But that's what we
one of the themes that it seems like we're hearing that John talks about in the book is the impact of migration and mobility. We have so many people moving, the privileged people moving because they can, digital nomads and that sort of thing, and then the people who are not privileged moving enforced migrations because of climate or war or whatever, and the impact of that on home. And then this resurgence of reverence for indigenous worldviews. And one definition of indigenous is it's people who belong to the land, as opposed to our colonial and orphan mode of thinking the land belongs to us, and that so many of us got disconnected. And so home is actually, for many of us, quite a fraught, complicated, and connecting to a domain. And I think there's no shame in not necessarily connecting. You don't have to engage in your, neighborhood locally. Like that's sort of the whole point, is that, you find the domain in which you feel alive, in which you find your people. And that's really the key, I think.
And that might be geographic home, or it might be a sphere of influence.
Yeah. Okay, so beautiful panelists, the conversation that was already starting, the guiding question now for this conversation is what needs to happen in order for this story to really take hold? And the conversation that was already starting, maybe we'll start right there and make it audible, was around so many of the things reflect the old story and reflect the old worldview, whether it's the lawyers or the hiring contracts. So, Imi, you were just in the middle of talking about this. Maybe you could reflect on that.
Thank you. I was so inspired by the two panelists, and I think what came out to me in a theme when Bethany first started to talk was how much we're all learning that the what we term in our work the dark matter, the legislation, the rules, the codes, the norms, the financial instruments, the ways of organizing, the things underneath the surface that we don't always see. But when you start to build something, you're like, hold on a second, this is all affecting how we work, how not fit for purpose they are. So what you find is that, like Bethany, we also crowdfunded, and you learn for many reasons why that's great, and what its limits are. We grew up in that era where social enterprise was pushed out as the way we were going to do all of this. But essentially, social enterprise was a model of ventures that borrowed the Silicon Valley model of investing money. We did loads of accelerators in the UK. We'll accelerate social ideas. we'll put money into them, we'll expect them to make a return, and at the same time they'll also make huge social change and everything will be okay, right? There'll be an app for this and we'll do an app for that, and there's no doubt that there was incredible work. Bethany's work showed that so clearly. But what that Silicon Valley model was built on was this idea that you invest in, 12 ventures. One will give you 100x, one will give you 10x, the rest will fail. Somehow in the middle of all of that extraction and generation of wealth will also shift complex social challenges. So what I was just saying was that what we've learned over the last 10, 12 years is that we need to reinvent the organization. Punitive employment contracts. We need to re-understand a generation that's coming up that thinks very differently about work. We are understanding so much from how to govern, how to finance, how to invest. And so I'll just finish on saying what I would say about what makes this story hold is this understanding that from all of these talks, we're working on parts of the story that are still models stuck in the 20th century economic model, and we're also trying to reinvent, and that's what makes our hard work hard. I think all of us will have incredible stories of hundreds of thousands of people came together or made this amazing thing, but simultaneously, this generation of whoever we are, I don't even know what label to put on us, is also trying to understand that our models, our organising methods are not fit for purpose, and we're trying to both reinvent democracy or finance and so on. So for it to take hold, we work on 3 layers: the dark matter, the everyday, and the dream matter, which means that you've got to look at the stuff under the surface, all these things are blocking. You've got to bring it into the everyday, in people's streets, in creative, playful ways, and you've got to hold that everyday in a way that is accessible, and people can touch and see and feel and participate in complex ideas. And you've also got to get out of the tyranny of now and be able to take long-term views. So we talk about that dream matter, the long-term, the imagination. And in the everyday, that's where that infrastructure comes into play. Like, in the end, this can't be extraordinary acts of service and participation. You have to just be able to walk down the road and participate in your citizen assembly or share something or make something together or so on. And so, that's what I think helps to take this make this story hold.
And maybe just to put a little bit, one sort of live example that's been talked about a fair bit into that context, the Patagonia moment of sort of exit to purpose, of creating a charity that then owns the organisation. It is a phenomenal thing, and I think a lot of what we try and do, what I'm trying to do in the world, is to say yes and to some of those things. But actually, it's not that creative, really. And it's still limited to these structures. Where's the power? There's not a shift of power distribution. There's still a kind of maximize the revenue, and then kind of have it owned by a charity, which are still those 20th century structures. And there may be more experiments that could take place. And like I say, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but there's this language that's starting to take shape of sort of exit to community and owned by the people who are the customers or the employees of that, not just sort of owned by a charity but still leaving the power over the decision making within a few hands. Like I say, I don't want to come across as critical, but I think it's an example of this thing of we don't have the models. We are both creating the practices and creating the structures that can sustain those practices. And that's part of why this is so hard, because when you don't have those models, any given decision you try and make, you look back to the default models that are offered by the consumer story, and it takes an awful surge of effort to try and build something new. I don't know if either of you would come in.
Yeah, I mean, just building on what Emmy said, I think that there's, the current model of funding that you were describing, it would prefer to break people and to break businesses than to not get a return on an investment, even if that's a social business. And the amount of entrepreneurs and, even really wonderfully intentioned funding bodies that are accidentally, reinforcing these narratives because they don't have other structures to lean on, or there isn't, it's hard to reinvent legal documentation. And it then just reinforces the same story, and then these beautiful organizations that should exist, that should be, small pockets that can grow over time, can't, or they do, and then they burn out and die because they can't deliver on these old narratives and these old KPIs and these old metrics. And then we're in this space of like, you know, entrepreneurs that quit starting things and they, you know, go into jobs or do something else. And it's a really complex space, I think. And I guess one of the speakers yesterday, Matilda Tam, talked about Earth Logic, and one of her points was plurality. That unfortunately, fortunately, I think we have to exist in pluralness right now, in these multiple narratives, in these multiple stories, with these multiple systems, some which are crumbling faster than others, and somehow, I think, have these types of situations so that we can learn and extrapolate models, ideas, etc., that are starting the news. So I was in this call with this amazing organization in Netherlands that has bought land and is essentially collectively regenerating it. And one of the co-founders is a lawyer. And this lawyer found this, you know, kind of existing legal thing that allowed them to put nature on their board. She hacked the kind of, you know, legal entity. She kind of reinterpreted it in a way that made perfect sense. And now their board includes nature on it. And, you know, she was a lawyer, and she just found this opportunity to bring her expertise, if you will, in a new way into a system which wasn't fit for purpose for what they needed. And of course, now that's like being replicated across the board. But I think it's finding those that are, you know, either reinventing the model or hacking the model or weaving the models together to create newness that we just have to kind of explore right now. It's, unfortunately, I don't think it's simple. I think it's going to stay complicated for a while. Sorry.
Embrace the
that's a little
complexity.
depressing.
No. Yago, did you have anything to add to that line?
Yes, I'm really interested in how to connect what you have been talking about. I mean, this kind of a way of engaging people by making things, no? Baking, okay, whatever. We're gonna build a urban garden here. We're gonna experiment with soil, as you said, or we're gonna make something for kids and then create a community space for daddies and kids and mummies and whatever. How this is connected with political, with policy making, no, and with the citizen assembly is like on top. It's super important issues that should be, you know, that are big dilemmas for the entire society, and how this is connected. And I was thinking that it's very difficult to engage people in politics. It's much easier to engage people in making things.
Yes.
So like the root-based, the primary step in participation is making things. So you go to the neighbors and you make things with people. And then from that, another level of citizenship emerged that is more political, because you are inventing a urban garden, but then you realize that there is no legal way to put the urban garden here because this belongs to the city council and there's impossible. So what about a citizen proposal to the council? No, so it's a level of, okay, we start making things and then we start making proposals to the government, and we have initiative, political initiative, and this is really powerful. So try to connect both and create participatory systems, not try to work isolated. So the one who makes things in neighborhoods, the one with citizen assemblies, trying to think a little bit more broader, and that is why now in several governments they are creating the participation areas, no, the open government areas, to try to create this kind of system that could be integrated. And finally, after the citizen proposal is finally the citizen assembly who can validate, okay, the mummies and daddies of the city are proposing to invest 10,000 million in parks for children. We're going to consider quietly. I mean, a representative sample of the city is going to validate that and maybe modulate a little bit the proposal and then approve. No, that will be the final stage.
I love that. It's like the compliment to the point about these models aren't there really visibly and off the peg, but they are forming, and some of them are there, like and some of these sort of some of the trends that are part of this, the emergence of platform cooperativism, this idea of that the new platform businesses might be owned by their users, not just by the owners, are examples of taking old models into this space and kind of working with them again. But also, I love what Yago's point makes me think of is how like they're sort of meeting each other and building up as it goes. So and just to make Yago's example of the citizen initiative in politics really real, one of my favourite examples is the city of Brussels. The Francophone Parliament of Brussels has a system where if 1,000 citizens put forward a proposal, then there has to be what's called a and deliberative committee set up, which is a quarter of the deliberative committee is made up of elected MPs, and the other 3/4 is randomly selected citizens, and they investigate this issue and then report back, and then that report back has to be answered publicly. So it's sort of like there's these sort of channels to allow this stuff to be heard, kind of forming, and there's the proposal, and it's happening, and it needs to accelerate.
Isn't John's enthusiasm contagious?
It's why I'm the only white man she'll work with.
But getting back to the other side of the coin, which is the difficulties in this and the burnout and like the hard part, which I think everybody used that word just now. So how, like on the more personal level, how do you sustain yourself? That's what I'd like to know. Any immediate responses?
Life question of everyone. I mean, I think, everyone's journey is very different. I've kind of cultivated a lot of self-care practices after probably having run my first business in a perpetual state of burnout. And I think most entrepreneurs are in that state constantly, and it's almost accepted and reinforced by the model, by the system, that unless you are always delivering and always on, and it's everything you do, that it's not enough. And I think what I've personally kind of changed for my own narrative is that it is enough, and my best is enough. And so it sounds quite simple, and I haven't done this alone, right? I've had coaches and help and therapy. And retreats and medicines and all kinds of things to find these places. But yeah, kind of, I think meditation is definitely one that I need for my own kind of sanity. And then I think the other is something that someone said in the audience about finding community. Like, I find my tribe, I've found my tribe, and I've found multiple tribes. And that has sustained me probably more than anything, is these tribes of people that are also taking risks in different ways. And that support that you can give each other, I think it's necessary. We're not on a hero's journey. I think that's an old story.
Right. Yago, you've been doing this, it's been a long, sustained push, if it's been since the 2011 moment.
But I have to say that I have been working for free a lot of time, like my free time. It was like my hobby, working in activist as participation, etc., with social movement, political parties. And then, in fact, I study physics, so I'm a physics teacher. I have been, with my kids, with my teenagers, and then going to be an activist outside my job. But at some point, it was so intense, the energy in this kind of participatory emerging movement, that we start to work with governments directly. So the governments wanted to do participation, and they need people who, like consultants, to help them to design participation and to help them to deliver participation. So the last years we have been working for governments. So for example, Barcelona city government, European Commission, the government of Cantabria. And we are moving now to a better system that is not having a clientelar relation with the government, because this is conflicted, a little bit conflicted, because you cannot press them as hard as you want, or you would like to press them, and to put red lines and these kind of things. So we are trying to receive money to help governments from other sources. For example, European research projects, foundations. So we can help governments like with an arm's length and with independence. So that's how, yeah.
Very different answer than therapy.
Yeah, I was thinking that too.
So I guess, but personally, I do have things to ground myself in, lots of the similar things that people have said. I guess as you get older, you start to figure out more of what that balance is required. I do think that I get to draw on a well of familial experiences that are were large acts of imagination and resilience and strength. For my grandparents were here post-partition, not here in the UK. They came to the UK post-partition. I get to ground when I talk about imagination in things like the fact that they were able to imagine an abundant, eclectic, not the opposite of zero-sum life for their children and particularly grandchildren, having lost everything and being displaced from home and everything they understood to be home, and to have lived 60 plus years with that displacement. What I think is what I can really draw on in this is that when I think about ideas like imagination, or I'm talking about it, or I'm talking about home, or I'm talking about what it means to build something from nothing, I lived in those experiences, and because I lived in an intergenerational home, that I think I've got a deep well that is linked to an ancestry and faith and other things that has always reimagined itself in the backdrop of like oppression and horror, and done it in ways that was really, really, really like bizarrely abundant. Like, I don't understand how they were such happy, incredible people. And so I often look around and sometimes both check myself and my own bewilderment in that. But I do something really practical though and it's not easy, and it doesn't mean that we always have like good years, but there are two ideas that I am staying really strong on. One is that the way we are currently organised in our economic goals, and Kate Raworth talks about this really clearly, about the endless pursuit of growth and GDP and this treadmill that we're on, is part of the systemic reasons as to why we are never going to feel like we are enough, and why nothing we do is gonna feel in tune with what we really know we need to do, which is to create an economy and discover what that is that lives in a state of balance and dynamic balance between the planet and what we need as people. And practically, as an organisation, I'm not very interested in continually operating within the current model. I try and am interested in how we build a platform for collective care. The work that Dark Matter Labs are doing with Beyond the Rules is unpacking power and understanding responsibility and accountability better. It's humanizing leaders better. Just because I sit up here, it can be easy to say that's power, but actually we've taken responsibility for people and things, and we're playing in different spaces to create better language for that. And so to try and have those continual reinforcing stories in myself and around me is how I can like stop myself from falling into free fall of like the scale of different things that are happening at the same time. That doesn't mean I'm saying that self-care things don't matter, but I think unless there is something deeper that they sit on top of, they're never enough, and they are actually a commodified version of like the economy telling you how to sort of pay to look after yourself within all the carnage it's creating, which can then just be really bewildering.
I think this is sort of where I would jump off as well. It's like one of the things that that we wrote about in the book actually is this idea that actually the hardest thing is trying to be good in the consumer story, right? The hardest thing, because the consumer story sort of says that if you're going to be good, if you're going to be worth listening to, then you have to never use a disposable cup, never fly, never eat meat, you have to be a saint before you're able to talk almost. And that's really hard work. There's sort of 50 things you can do to save the world. It's very individualizing, and it puts a huge amount of pressure on the individual. Whereas I think one of the joys of the Citizen story is that it sort of says, actually, the way to be good, find home, find the others, decide what to do together. And it sort of has its own sustaining because it roots in community. That said, I'm not terribly good at the self-care part of this, as several people on this panel know too well, hence the knowing smiles. And part of that really actually is because I think some of the role I'm trying to play is going into the space of positions of power and trying to show this possibility, this story to to people in those spaces and ask them to open the door. This kind of experience, coming to Fixing the Future, in a way, is super regenerative for me. Like standing in the citizen story and with those who are in it is regenerative, whereas going into the consumer story, going into the hearts of that story, the European Central Bank or a massive company or whatever, and trying to stand in there is hard and draining. But it also feels like some of the work that I have to be part of. So there's all of that kind of mulched in. But I think like what I find regenerative is and sustaining for me personally is to stand in the citizen story and stand in what's possible instead of standing in what's wrong. I don't know if we want to see if anyone wants to take it elsewhere or what you think.
Oh, right. Questions. Does anyone have a question? Yes, there's a hand right here that I saw immediately. Say it loud.
There is a mic coming, I think.
Okay. Okay, it's coming. It's coming.
Okay. Yeah, it's for Yago. I think the Citizens Assembly thing you were describing is so fascinating, and so I don't want this to just come across as like a critique or anything, but when you were talking about how you selected people, I was really interested that you selected it based on population density. My first thought would be that would, give someone in LA like a huge advantage in getting chosen over someone from somewhere like Alaska, where I'm from. And even though some of my best friends are from LA, and I do love them, they think that living in a hot concrete void is like the norm and like an acceptable way to live your entire life. And there was a lot of talk yesterday about like shifting benchmarks and stuff. So I was wondering if that was a concern in like how you were choosing people to participate, and whether or not that was borne out, or whether you ended up with people from like all kinds of rural versus urban, or if there were other ways that you had considered selecting people that were just not practical. If you could just speak about like that selection process, I think it's so interesting.
Should we just take one or two more and then we can sort of give a couple of answers?
Okay.
Any more? Or if no one has any questions.
Sorry, I don't know if I got the point of the question. So you mean if it was a bias in relation to urban city?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Any more? Any more?
There's this one in the middle.
There's another one.
This question is mainly for Bethany. Love what you're doing with putting children at the center of the conversation. But I just wanted to ask about the role that you see parents playing in the work that you're doing, but also, I think also as I've had this conversation with a few friends, as grown-up children, we feel like we're also educating our parents or another generation that do things completely differently, but also we're learning from them too, and mixing that together. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the role that parents play in your the work that you do.
Yeah.
One more down the front, if we may, APEC. Right down the front. And then we'll just give a few answers and wrap ourselves up.
Thanks. I'm probably not going to articulate this very well, but I'm just interested in separating out this idea of politics or policy being created through things like citizen assemblies, which are actually a very heady process and very dominant around a particular type of like knowing and decision making, and actually maybe things like making and creating and imagining are better or different ways of also being political, because the propositioning and the creation can be political and provide different ways of people knowing. Like you can have an embodied sense of what's possible in a way that just being presented with decisions to be made, which is really the model of a citizen assembly. So I'm just interested in how you see some of that.
Thanks very much.
Okay, maybe the first question. Thank you for your question. I think it's a very interesting question. Well, obviously, most of the people live now in cities. That is a reality. So It's not that there is a bias, but there is just more probability. But even because our system of random of putting the point was not perfect, in fact, the bias was the opposite, because imagine a municipality, like a region with a city here, but all this is rural, and the point was allocated like random inside the municipality, because we don't have the density map inside every municipality. So finally, many points got out of the city centers and got out of the outskirts of the city that could be rural. So finally, the bias was exactly the opposite. More outskirts, more rural, outside cities than real city downtowns.
Right.
And that was the case. And for the other question that I think is connected with, I think this is connected with what I said about the citizen initiative, from making things in the neighborhoods and citizen initiatives. And the point is that every time there is a citizen initiative, there is an interest group. You cannot avoid that. So it's not the whole citizens who are creating that proposal. It could be completely biased. So the daddies and mommies who are leftists in the downtown, for example, highly educated, and they have created these proposals. So that initiative are great, but at some point you need to construct that with the whole spectrum of the people, all ideologies, all ages, all socioeconomic backgrounds, to see if those proposals could fit into a policy that is for all. It's not just for this group of people. So both things works, but each thing has to have the right space, I would say, in a system of participation.
And just to add to that question, since we're on it, we're developing a tool right now, and it's very early days, but the question is around how to put kids' voices at the center of futures, because a lot of futures work in business and policy doesn't include the voice of kids ever. One, because it's hard, it's complicated. Kids don't contribute necessarily the way an adult may, and maybe they shouldn't. And so the area of exploration we're having right now, which is in line with what you're asking, is our question is, are there other ways that kids can contribute their dreams, hopes, needs into that process, but using different mediums, using making, building, creating, because adults are very good at bullet points and PowerPoint. Maybe that's not the best way of imagining and making decisions. And so our exploration, and it very much is an experiment, I don't know the answer to this, is, are there tools that we can create that can at scale bring diverse voices of kids into futures work in a way that isn't just so from the head, that comes from other parts of our ways of knowing, and that, hopefully it will contribute to the conversation and maybe create other platforms for other contributions to policy decision-making that is not just the same.
I'm conscious of our time, but wondering if you just want to say a word to the parents thing, and then I'll maybe wrap.
Oh yeah, parents. Yeah, really great question, and partially the journey I'm on with our new organization. Yeah, we were just talking about this. Parents are often treated in the kind of current story as wallets in a kind of transaction, which is just shit, because it's a really hard job and really important, and a lot of parents are depleted and on that same journey of, contemplating stepping out of the current system, having new norms, provided for them in terms of flexible work, possibly, et cetera, and wanting to reimagine these family units and structures. And so to answer your question on what's the role of parents, it's fundamental. There just isn't a lot of infrastructure or focus on whether it be sharing some of this academic knowledge with parents around what's happening in terms of brain development and kind of how their children are developing. We're doing an experiment actually later today around a project we're doing around blue ecosystems and awe. And we've been measuring awe through a whole bunch of different interesting creative outputs. And what we're experimenting with is giving parents a role in the experience, because parents often in kids' experience are kind of helicopters or interfering or sometimes telling their kids they're doing it wrong, which isn't necessarily a great role for them to play. And so what we're experimenting with is giving them a role as observer. And so we've used some kind of structures that often happen in assessment around observation, observing their facial expressions, observing their bodily functions, observing their eye dilations, and helping them to see that when that's happening, your child is in a state of flow. It's a kind of intrinsic motivation that's happening that is a good thing. And those things don't happen very much to parents, unfortunately. And so our interest is in how can we
And they certainly
that
don't
more.
happen in transactions, right?
No.
I'm conscious of time, I want to wrap us up, but just to finish this sort of where we end the book, actually, and the sort of the without which nothing of this citizen story, and if you go away with only one thing, it is this kind of belief in humanity, is this idea that actually people are sources of ideas and energy and resources, not just selfish individuals out and pursuing their self-interest and looking for transactions. And just to end there, we quote Rebecca Solnit in her book Hope in the Dark, and she distinguishes between hope and optimism, and says optimism is the belief that things will be all right no matter what we do. Pessimism believes things will be rubbish no matter what we do. Hope is in the space between. And she says authentic hope requires clarity, seeing the troubles in this world, and imagination, seeing what might lie beyond those situations that are perhaps not inevitable and immutable, particularly if we believe in people. And the final kind of thing we leave the book on is the question that sort of sustains me in my work, which is like trying to ask myself every day, what would you do in this time if you truly believed in yourself and in those around you? If you started from that point, what might you do in this day? So thank you for listening to us and having us, and thank you to the panel very much.